watched through every movie in my annual holiday canon. So I feel ready. I am theoretically gonna go take the Eucharist tomorrow for Christmas Day. And yeah, I'm ready for the new year. New Year is always an interesting feeling for me because it always sort of feels like I have been through a large ordeal, and like I am coming to the end of that ordeal, and I'm sort of like looking over, into what's to come. And usually that fills me with excitement, even when there's no reason to be excited. And I'm able to usually preserve that feeling for the first, I don't know, 5-6 days of January before something bad happens, as it did in 2020 or 2021. Sorry.
Well, look, I mean, we spoke briefly, off before we went live, and we speak outside of this context, and it bears repeating. I hold you in very high regard, and you have a very, have a special place in my heart. I consider you a brother and fellow traveler on this path, and I'm very much genuinely. This isn't just like talk; like this is genuine. I'm very much in awe of how much you do, and may God, continue to bless you in everything that you do, because you really put your heart and soul into everything that you do, and you have a lot of bubbles, a lot of balls up in the air, maybe bubbles as well.
Ooh, I like bubbles as an image better, I think.
Well, maybe that brings us to the question of the metaverse, right? So from real balls, right? I mean, juggling balls, not male balls, but juggling balls, maybe male balls. Anyway, okay, let's get it going somewhere else. But from juggling real physical balls to juggling, I mean, the metaverse is some weird thing. Do you want to get us going on this topic?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about the metaverse that I notice, and I just did very kind of basic preliminary reading in the lead up to this conversation. The metaverse belongs to one of those efforts in technology that actually has its origin in science fiction. And this is, science fiction and fantasy are, as big for me. I'm a big lover of the genres. And I do believe very strongly in the ability of those genres to influence the real world, because it happens all the time, right? Jules Verne is the first guy to talk about submarines, right? And now we have submarines. In the 1960s, in the late 60s, when Star Trek, the original series, came on screen, we saw the very first version of a cell phone, right? In the form of the little communicators that they flip open, and now we have cell phones. They're everywhere, right? So yeah, Ready Player One, Snow Crash before Ready Player One. Sort of contemporaneously with this, you also get franchises like Star Wars, franchises, sort of riffing off of the space opera genre, where you have, this kind of communication that's both digital and in person, and it is coexisting or competing with other kinds of communication, some more traditional, some more spiritual. Luke, turn off your targeting computer, right? And so I think maybe that's actually a good way to kind of frame this discussion, is that, the current efforts of tech companies to push the metaverse as kind of the brave new world for social media, for interaction, for whatever. This is one take on how to translate an idea that we've been collectively dreaming about for many decades now. It doesn't have to be the only take. I want to say, I guess, that there's a way to isolate questions about the intentions of the people who are doing this.
Can I mean, I love that.
Yeah, please do.
I love that point about, the whether it's the collective dreaming. I mean, it's interesting how collective dreams even come about, but certainly certain individuals, and something may be said about the zeitgeist, right? And there's something in the air, all these types of expressions, that certainly certain people are tapping into certain things at different times in this kind of continuously unfolding human drama. and they're able to bring it down from the ether, as it were, and turn it into reality. And the issue of how sci-fi all too often, very often, influences real life. It stops being fictional and becomes very real. I mean, a very interesting example I remember hearing about a number of years ago now, which really blew my mind. The first time I really kind of started thinking in a serious way about how influential, deeply influential sci-fi, the genre is, and that is the story of Blade Runner. I don't know if you're aware that the sort of dystopian city that was designed for the set of Blade Runner, the original movie, that look was then subsequently copied by many cities. Just really weird.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah. So I mean, sci-fi and fantasy, they not only influence tech, they also influence aesthetics, they influence values. I mean, like there are people in the world who honestly self-identify as Jedis for their religion, right? And there I think are two broad ways to kind of react to that. One is to kind of be like, oh, well, this is a silly amount of investment to have in, fiction. I think that that's actually kind of a small-minded way of approaching this, because I think it misunderstands why we engage in these genres. These genres belong to the same kind of thing that like apocalyptic literature belongs to, that prophetic and sapiential literature belong to, which is not to say that, sacred texts are intrinsically fictional or something. It's to say that all of these texts are engaging in questions of futurism, right? They are engaging in dreaming about what the future could be, might be, what we hope it will be, what we think it will be, right?
And also, I mean, something that just popped into my mind right now as you were saying that, those very, very powerful insights, making those powerful insights, that the nature of any text, right? I mean, whether it's a literal sort of textbook that we read, scripture historically has played a very, very major role in the shaping of the collective imaginary, right? But we have a very, right, continuing really from your original point, we have a very real, organic, sort of living, breathing relationship to the texts that inhabit our mind spaces, right? And the fictional genre, right, and we don't have to go on and on about this, but I mean, bears mentioning, right, that the fictional genre has played historically, there have been very serious studies about this, in the very creation of the modern self, right? The fictional novelistic sort of genre, and sci-fi, of course, is continuation of that. Movies in many ways are a continuation of that also.
So there, along these lines, there's a super decent argument to be made that before St. Augustine's Confessiones, the genre of the autobiography did not exist, right? And the way that an autobiography teaches you to think about yourself as functionally a narrative, right? Like your notion of yourself as a narrative that proceeds from point A to point Z, has precedence in pre-Augustinian culture. Like I'm especially thinking of, what is a very important philosophical binary for me between Parmenides and Heraclitus, right? Like Heraclitus's river certainly provides a precedent for thinking of the self in that way. But once Augustine writes the Confessiones, my gosh, like the psychology of the West is forever affected by it, right? And similarly, I mean, and this is why, apart from just being a simple lover of pop culture, this is why so many pop culture franchises are genuinely worthy of study, because they have actual impact on the way people think, right? More frequently than the academic stuff that I'm also nerdy for, right?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. I mean, what has been one of the most, I mean, you already alluded to, I mean, you already mentioned it, Star Wars has played a huge role in literally how people think and see themselves and relate to one another, right? And the transcendent.
it shapes everything from, Star Wars is a great example because it shapes everything from the way that many modern people think about what they want the future to be like, right? When they think about humanity becoming a spacefaring civilization or joining a universe full of intelligent beings, it shapes the way a lot of, it both participates in conversation about where religions are going in the future, but it also, reflects like hopes, right? For what religion can be kind of in the future, for what some people like legitimately want their traditions to morph into, right? I for one would love it if Christianity basically just became the Jedi. It would be a much healthier religion were it to do that for sure. I just saw Spider-Man the other day, right? Like Marvel exercises an enormous influence on the way that real people are thinking about their world. I mean, there's an entertainment value to this stuff, right? Like, I mean, most people are going to see this because they want a good time, but it also has a deep impact on the way people, average people are shaping their cosmology, just the way that mythology has always done. In the ancient world, your thoughts about the past, about the present, about the future, they're shaped by the stories that you're hearing. Most people for most of history have not been able to read or write, and most people have not been able to, they haven't had the luxury of like, just sitting back and like, what's it all about? Like we have all this philosophical literature from the ancient schools of philosophy, and it's actually a very tiny like minority of the population that's ever had the time to think about that kind of stuff. For most people, myth, right, legend, these things reflect their values, their hopes, their fears. It's one thing to philosophize about, if you're like an ancient Greek, what is Heracles really as a divinized human? And it's another thing to just be like a farmer who wants Heracles to like, fight off your enemies for you because he's close and he cares, and like he's done this kind of stuff before. And so I think Star Wars, Marvel, franchises like this, they perform very similar functions in our culture, right? Which is they sort of recapitulate these kinds of myths. And when we come to the metaverse, I think that what the metaverse sort of regurgitates as a literary concept is the notion of the capacity to use technology, the capacity to use, what is effectively magic, if we're looking at it with appropriate eyes, right? To use technology, to use science, to use magic, whatever word you want to use, to sort of overcome human limitations with regards to space and time, right? Like from another fantasy franchise that comes to mind, in Lord of the Rings, oh gosh, my Tolkien love is betraying me right now because I can't think of the name of it, but the orbs that the Astari use to kind of communicate across vast distances that the kings used to use. We're doing that right now, right? we just call it a computer, and we just think of it as a bit of technology that's sort of part of the popular cultural consciousness. And that's like how this kind of stuff usually works, right? So all of that to say, I'm confident that like, if by metaverse what we mean basically is augmentation of ordinary reality using technology for purposes of communication, that's coming one way or another, right? Like that's always been coming. It's already here, like in the sense that we're doing this. The question is always not like, is it going to happen? It's how is it going to happen? Who's going to be running it? Who's going to be setting the rules for how it works? Is it going to be constructed in a way that helps us or in a way that hurts us, right? Oh, I think you're muted.
A very, very significant metaphor in thinking through all of this, for me at least, and for many others, is, speaking of movies and speaking of sci-fi, is The Matrix, right? So, and the latest installment's just coming out, has already come out. So we're already in it, as you've mentioned, because of the fact that and you and I have literally never seen each other in person, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yet I feel so, very connected to you in a very deep way. So it's like, it's very magical, to use that word, right, as you did already. In many ways it's very powerful, and in some ways it's a little unnerving, and this is in the nature of technologies, right? Some may say, I mean, this quote from one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time, Arthur C. Clarke. He said something along the lines, to remember the quote, that any sufficiently advanced technology
Is
in its
indistinguishable from magic.
from
Yeah.
magic, right? But with time, right, what happens is it becomes so normalized that we don't even notice it, right? Say if I could somehow magically bring myself, whoever that person was 10 years ago, into this current present right now, I would literally be struggling to make sense of stuff around me. I mean,
Yeah,
that's no
yeah.
exaggeration. This has happened with people who've been in prison, for long periods of time and haven't necessarily engaged in the real world. It's interesting that we use quotation marks. Maybe being in prison in some ways is being more, I don't know. Anyway.
That's a very platonic image, actually,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah,
Being in
that
prison and
occurred
being
to me as
unable
well.
to deal with the real. I was
Yeah.
thinking when you were talking that there are like a million problems with the ancient aliens crowd, like in the arguments that they make and the way that they make them. Most notably that they their theory seems to be like predicated on a kind of unexamined racism, right? That like ancient like they seem to assume that ancient non-white cultures just simply couldn't have done amazing things, which bothers me immensely. But one of the problems that I have is actually with their reductionism around these questions of science, technology, and magic and divinity, right? Because they seem to presume that, like, well, the minute that you say, okay, an ancient god of some kind is actually like an astronaut visitor, right? who's who's come down from above, and like once we understand that, we can sort of ditch the god language and we can get to the real stuff. That actually misunderstands, I think, what god language does, right? It misunderstands that divinity is a relative category when you're talking about finite contingent beings, that all ancient people understood that there's a hierarchy of divinity. There's the one God who is the absolute wellspring of being, consciousness, bliss, divinity. And then beneath that, right, like pouring out from that are innumerable devas, gods, whatever. And some of them are more corporeal than others, right? And I use that I would use that as kind of a parallel for thinking about not being reductionistic about our current, technological advancements with respect to metaverse, with respect to anything else. Yeah, it's tech, right? It's science. We know it. We understand how to do it. We're pushing the boundaries of what we can do all the time. There's something really nice about that. There's something really neat about it. It's also not magic, right? It's especially if you understand like what ancient people and medieval people understood magic to be, and if you understand that the modern sciences actually come out of a shared tradition with Western magical practices, and that like many of the founders of modern science were deeply interested in occult practices, right?
Well, I was just going to say, Sir Isaac Newton, it's said that 80% of his writings deal with the occult, which is fascinating, really interesting. But we could, I mean, this is a phenomenal sort of start. I want to dive, even further into the very topic of not the Matrix, but the metaverse. The two maybe are interchangeable, right? And so what we're going to do is take a look at one of these articles that we found, an NPR article, and just see what they have to offer us. So I'm just going to read through this. The metaverse is already here. The debate now is over who should own it. Okay. By now, you've likely heard of the metaverse. Last month, CEO Mark Zuckerberg sent everyone running to their dictionaries to figure out what he was talking about when he said Facebook was changing its name to Meta, and declared the metaverse not only the next chapter for his company, but the next chapter for the internet. The thing is, the word and concept aren't new. Neil Stevenson coined the term in his 92 science fiction book, Snow Crash, as you mentioned rightly, in which people use avatars to explore an online world. A number of small metaverses have since developed where people meet, play games, and even watch live shows. Some of those early adopters aren't happy with a large corporation staking claim. Could you continue reading, please?
Yeah, what does the metaverse look like right now? The metaverse is described as an internet 3.0, a place where people can do real life things like work out, meet with colleagues, or take a class, but all online and in virtual reality. Jason Moore teaches television and virtual reality at Brooklyn College and spends a couple of hours in the metaverse every day. These are virtual worlds that when you're inside of them, feel like you're inside a kind of a cool video game, he said. But it's so much more than a game because it's like the internet where you're socially connected. So you can do just about anything in the metaverse. I might pause and note that I'm not a huge gamer. I like video games, and several of my friends are really into gaming. I think he maybe underestimates what playing a video game in 2021 is actually like, because there are usually sort of wholesale communities involved in these games that do all kinds of things together.
I was actually also going to mention, I came across an interview just this morning, actually, or a conversation with Elon Musk on the top. I don't know when the conversation actually happened, but I came across this particular chunk of his conversation today, where he was asked about, what his thoughts are on the metaverse. And bearing in mind, this is the guy who owns Neuralink, right? Which is interesting. Mm-hmm. His immediate response was almost to like, he kind of almost made a face and he's like, oh yeah, I mean, in so many ways said, oh, I don't see what the big deal is. It's like wearing, a TV screen on your face. We grew up hearing, don't sit too close to the TV, don't sit too close to the TV. And now we're literally going to have these screens in front of our eyes. And he was like, in so many words, he was saying, I don't really see people spending that much time on it, because people want to go out in the real world. I'm like thinking, dude, do you know? I mean, that's really weird coming from you, unless there's some other things going on. And then he was subsequently asked, because he also said there's the issue with gaming in this sort of virtual reality context where with people get motion sickness and things like that. And until that issue is fixed, it's going to continue to be, as far as he can tell, not be so popular apparently. And then one of the interview, there was like a group of people talking to him at the same time, and one of the guys posed to him, "Do you think this is something Neuralink can fix, where literally like people literally can't tell the difference because it's just kind of, in so many words, I can't remember the exact language, that it's kind of being pumped into your brain, as it were, like a la the Matrix a bit." Any kind of nodded, maybe that's what we need. So yeah, maybe people are underestimating the power of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's power both for good and for ill, right? So I am rarely a person who is like the sky is falling when it comes to new things, even new things that I don't like. Right? Like, I'm not really a huge fan of virtual reality. I also acknowledge that for some people who are super isolated and who, genuinely get something out of it, it's better than nothing. Right? I'm also a person who's perennially kind of afraid of what the world will look like by the time I'm old. Right? But that's also ubiquitous, right? Like, that's just that's a reaction that most people have, is, fear of change. In Musk's case, one of the things that interests me about the way that he tends to respond to ideas that have intellectual overlap with things that he does is his responses always seem to suggest to me that a lot of what he works on, he sees as being for other people and not for him, which is concerning to me. Neuralink itself seems like a really, I used it in a lesson once on golemization. I was talking about how in literature, like, this is another literary origin for this kind of idea, right? Is the idea of the golem, that you bring to life using complex magic, and it's sort of like a human, but it's also sort of not like a human. And then that leads to the reverse possibility in literature. The ultimate version of that is the golem that gets ensouled, right? So like in Marvel, Vision, the synthezoid, or C-3PO in Star Wars or whatever. But then the reverse trend in literature that's sort of connected to the same thing are humans that become golems, right? Humans that are golemized through inappropriate combination with technology. So not just, not something life-saving and changing like getting a prosthetic, right? Or getting, getting important technology that helps to regulate your body, but like having your brain controlled, right? Or, being kind of locked into like a virtual reality that you can't
and
get
our
out
brains
of.
are already being controlled. I mean, the documentary, Netflix documentary, Social
Yeah, yeah,
Dilemma,
yeah.
not, I mean, based on very serious research that predates it, interviewing some very serious people, have been saying, makes this very point that we are not the free agents that we think we are. And when it gets to a certain point, and if we're already that, right, if we're already being manipulated in a significant way by devices that are, for the time being, not literally on our very person. I mean, we may be holding them, but they're not. Our brains aren't jacked into them. How much more so if the literal melding of man and machine happens, right?
Yeah, and this is the thing too, right? It's always a question of who, how, and why, right? Again, I think it would be wonderful if our medical technology advanced the science of prosthetics so that like prosthetics were, robotic prosthetics are like an ordinary part of how we treat people who need them, right? And they're easily accessible and they're not exorbitantly expensive and whatever. That would be amazing. That's a very different set of things from like what Neuralink is trying to do, right? It's a very, I mean, one of the reasons that I think people should be concerned about that kind of thing is, okay, in principle, is getting some kind of update to your nervous system that involves technology, is that intrinsically wrong on the face of it? Well, I think that's kind of a difficult argument to make. I think the easier argument to make, and the more important one, is how do you know who controls the switch, right? Who controls the switch? How do you know who they are? How do you know what they plan to do with it? How do you know that they won't misuse it? That's really the more important set of questions, right? Like, so to take it out of the realm of like an abstract morality, right? Or an abstract set of attitudes or opinions towards technology or the relationship of technology and biological life, and just bring it down to the most basic level of how do you know what you're signing away, right? And how will you know it until it's too late? And we already don't know that most of the time, right? Like I never read a technology agreement when I've got to use something.
Exactly.
I didn't read it for my smart TV. I don't read it for my Apple iPhone. And the really actually, for things like that, there's a good argument to be made for not reading through those, because the fact of the matter is that to keep up, right, with tech and the way tech's shaping the world, like you've got to have devices like this most of the time for most people, and you're not going to be able to qualify the restrictions that they're putting right on use of their products. So it's actually just in your best interest to just say, okay, whatever, right? But when it comes to your actual bodily autonomy, when it comes to your actual corpus, right, I feel like it's more important to be, cognizant of what you're signing up for. I mean, it's it's as basic an argument for like, well, why is getting drunk a bad idea? Well, because then like you won't be fully in control of your actions probably, right? And unless you're being cared for by, a group of people that you can trust, you might end up making some like really horrific mistakes, right? It's important to not forfeit that level of autonomy when it's unclear who you're forfeiting it to.
It's very important and very difficult at the same time, as you've already alluded to. It's very important and very difficult because if the whole world, right, seems to be lurching forwards, forever in one direction, this direction of progress, right, and the sort of insanely rapid clip at which these technologies are refined, and to not engage with those technologies means somehow becoming irrelevant. right? Very, very quickly. Right. I mean, the fact that we're doing this, right? This we're making use of significant, I mean, in objective terms, relative to what we know of human history that's preceded us, relative to older times, we have some pretty space age, right? Very technologically advanced stuff at our disposal that we're making use of right now. Right.
More power than what sent Apollo 13 to the moon.
Exactly. Right. So if we didn't engage in this stuff, if I was, I spend as someone who's not unintelligent, I still already spend an inordinate amount of time online, and I'm very conscious of the fact that, I mean, even when I'm doing it, I'm like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time online, and anyway, so it's very hard to not engage.
And technologies tend to layer, right?
Mm.
So on the one hand, you and I are speaking on computers into Zoom, and that Zoom is going up on YouTube, and that's something that I can't do with like a book, any book. So I'll just grab my copy of the Apostolic Fathers. This can't help me do any of that. But at the same time, I have this, and I don't want to throw this away, right? Because there's a utility to having this and to not being reliant on a digital form of it, which I also have, right? It's also, we still use wheels. Wheels are like, wheels and fire are like some of our earliest technological advancements as a species. We still use them because they're useful, and because not just because we haven't found better replacements for them. I'm sure that, right, someday we'll figure out like hover technology in a way that's, sort of outmodes the car as it currently exists. We already sort of do that with, magnetic high-speed rail. I should say, we don't. My country doesn't, because my country makes really bad decisions often about what to invest in and not invest in. But lots of places in the world do use high-speed rail, right, which has already kind of outmoded the wheel, but they also still use cars. And so what that says to me is that, look, if by metaverse what you mean is we're going to augment reality enough that certain spaces are a combination of physical and digital reality, right? I don't have a fundamental moral problem with that. I don't have a fundamental moral problem with it, not only because like it's an idea that comes out of science fiction anyway, right? So like I can think of science fiction franchises that where it's not overpowering and it's not super damaging, right? And it's like, okay, so there's a way to conceive of this that's not just awful, right? But if the idea is, and many of the people who are pushing this are also people who are interested in like transhumanism, right? And in this, like, we want to transcend.
Can you remind viewers and listeners who may not know what transhumanism is?
So transhumanism, to be clear, has nothing to do with gender ideology, which is the other major use of trans in public discourse today. Transhumanism is an intellectual movement that's very popular in Silicon Valley. It's very popular with people who are big in with the tech industry. So, people like Yuval Harari are very appreciative of this idea that kind of the next and final stage of human evolution is to sort of fully digitize consciousness to sort of transcend our, organic state and sort of self-deify through technology. Now, I'm hardly the first person to notice this. I'm actually just regurgitating the arguments of several people that I respect in saying this, but there are various problems with this image. I think what the transhumanists are plugging into that's ubiquitous in religion, right, is that the spiritual goal of humans is to transcend the human condition as it currently exists. However that's conceived, right, whether that's conceived as escape from rebirth, whether that's conceived as resurrection and descent to, a godlike or angelic state of life, whether that, however understood, transcendence is definitely a common spiritual goal of the human race. This is a transcendence that's brought about effectively by technology or magic, and that clearly is not actually for everybody, right? Like, and that's part of the point. is that the people who are leading these charges, they're not really interested in a liberation. Like even if we bracket for a moment the question of whether what they envision is actually liberation, I don't think it's actually liberation, right? But bracketing that for a minute, they understand it to be that, and it's also not for everybody in their minds, right? Like the true this is truly for people who basically believe death is oblivion, and this is like their only path out of it, right? Now, is what they conceive of as the goal liberation, or is it even possible? I don't think it's liberation because, and you see this in different transhumanist literature dealing with the question, if the goal is to immortalize humans through technology, how do you deal with the fact that that technology will be subject to the same limitations of physics as our bodies are, right? Like, how do you deal with the heat death of the universe or the big crunch or whatever? And the answer like varies between these people. Like for some of them, the idea is that you're just going to stretch out the last moment of reality into kind of like an infinite, afterlife. The idea for some of them is just perpetuity for perpetuity's sake until it's impossible. But it's also questionable if what they intend to do with this is even possible, right? So like David Bentley Hart is probably the best crusader about this, that, what they envision digitizing your consciousness depends on an understanding of consciousness that's not really philosophically solvent, right? It depends on the idea that consciousness is a product of matter, which is a very questionable position to hold on the basis of what we know about philosophy of mind, neuroscience. It very much seems to be the other way around to a lot of philosophers of mind, and even to a lot of neuroscientists who work in the field. And so that raises the question, it raises the specter of, because transhumanism kind of stands in the background of the Tech Valley version of the metaverse, right? This is sort of step one towards a humanity that has kind of fully translated itself into this iteration of itself. There are reasons to be concerned. Like, there are not conspiracy theory-ish reasons to be concerned. There are just reasons to be concerned on the grounds that the people who are shaping popular culture, shaping to some extent public policy, right? They're people whose vision for the human race, when it's actually investigated down to its depths, truly awful, truly awful thing.
No, I know. I mean, again, one does not have to delve in conspiracy theories to come to some of these conclusions, right? Because one just has to look at stuff that's known for certain, that's undeniable. I mean, if we accept the fact that the major movers and shakers of the world today are these tech giants, right? People in charge of these major tech companies, and they're playing a major role as far as the very shaping of society, right? And from one point of view, a former, we were talking about him before we went live, I can't remember his name now, I'm sure I can pull his name up shortly, former Facebook exec who's now a billionaire, so was doing his own stuff, came out and was very, very critical of Facebook. Interesting that he was making those criticisms after he left Facebook. But anyway, when it was okay for him, but he basically said, Facebook is ripping apart the fabric of society. So however we look at it, these tech giants are extremely influential, and they really don't care about the general well-being of people. I mean, there's one, I think, brief documentary I was watching last night, if I'm not mistaken, I think made by Vice on the metaverse and Facebook's sort of questionable sort of intentions behind wanting to be the first, the first company in this realm. Yeah.
Two things on that, right? So first of all, why did Facebook change to Meta? It was because they were being called out in Congress for for the way that their algorithms basically shaped polarization in the United
Yeah,
States
yeah, yeah.
during the pandemic and during the 2020 election, right? This was I mean, it was a marketing scheme, right? Like it was a way of trying to save face in the midst of like a big public egg on their face, right? The second thing, to your point about billionaire tech giants not really caring about ordinary people. I mean, I'm thinking of the recent kind of showdown between the whatever UN committee it is that oversees food and poverty things and Elon Musk, where Elon Musk sort of, if you read his Twitter, he's just like constantly flippant, right? Like about really basic ideas like whether he should be taxed and things like this. And he asked, like, what will you actually do? Like, if I were to give you enough money that you say would help solve world hunger, what would you actually do with it? The UN came back with like a stratified plan, like, here is how we would spend this money to resolve hunger in the world. And like Musk hasn't replied, right? Because at heart, that was never going to be something he actually did, right? This is a way of him trying to shape his fan base to not realize that like glorification of him is not in anyone's best interest, right? And this is actually this is a trend throughout history, is that oligarchs, to remain in power, have to convince the populace constantly that it is more trouble than it is worth to reclaim wealth and power from them. So like in Greek antiquity, I'm blanking on the name of the guy that wrote this book. I had to do a thing for it in grad school. And if I remember it, I will post it to a comment on this video later. But there was this great book on oligarchy in Greek antiquity that makes effectively this argument. Oligarchia is a real political regime in the ancient world. And it basically relied constantly on the oligarchs making the argument to the demos, to the landowning populace, that it is not worth, it's not worth the amount of time, effort, energy, violence, whatever it will take to remove the oligarchia and to install democratia, right? To install rule of the demos. And what seems to have happened is that from the archaic period to the classical period, each individual Greek polis basically comes to the conclusion that the oligarchs cease being able to make that argument to the demos effectively. And so democratia becomes the norm for the local polis. And it remains the norm for the polis even into the Hellenistic period, when you start getting like big empires, right? Democratia coexists with higher, more centralized forms of government, right? In our case, the oligarchs are not just political elites, although certainly there's a kind of oligarchy that goes on with political elites and their relationship to lobbyists and whatever. The true oligarchs are the 1% of people who hold enough wealth and power over public society to continually make the argument that it's not actually worth trying to take what I have and redistribute it among yourselves. It'll take too much effort,
And there was a study, I think it was done by Princeton in 2014, that proved beyond a shadow of doubt, as if we needed that proof, that the US is an oligarchy, not a democracy. So yeah, it's a very
yeah. Look, I mean, look at the major policy showdowns that are going on in my country right now around basic things like, can we put together a social spending bill that serves ordinary working people and the poor and pays for it by taxing the rich? And the answer for even notionally a Democrat like Joe Manchin is no. It's apparently too much money to spend on making sure that ordinary people don't have to pay like $1,000 for insulin or something every month. It's look at the struggle that any Voting Rights Act of Congress in the last 10 years has faced. None of them have been passed because they keep being holed up. I mean, it's effectively a very simple argument, right? There's one side that's arguing that elections, that the right of every American citizen to vote should be so fundamental that no local law can interfere with it. And then there's another side that's attempting to make the argument that no, we don't want everybody to vote. And why is that? Because they know that, like, it's very simple. It's because they know that, like, the minute that everybody's vote actually counts for something, their ability to function as a political party is torn apart, because they are fundamentally, the party of the oligarchs, effectively. And it's yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, and maybe we should continue with the article and come back to some of these points. So where did we leave off?
I think right after, so you can do just about anything in the metaverse.
Right. Please continue.
Anyone can strap on a virtual reality headset in their living room and enter an alternate online universe. There are currently a handful of mostly unconnected metaverse platforms, including VR Chat, Neos VR, and Roblox. When Moore connects, he arrives in his home world, which he describes as a little planet. From there, he navigates to other locations. He recently watched a live performance called Mycelia, set in an underground cave. It felt like it was carved out of gemstones and stalactites and with a beautiful water cave. And this incredible artistic troupe actually connected electrodes, and these mushrooms were sending out electrical signals that were translated into music, he said.
Should we watch a bit of this and see what it looks like? So I wonder how it works with copyright, because sometimes I know on YouTube that you can get hit with like copyright issues if you show some. So maybe
that might happen. Maybe just if you're interested, go look at the article. Maybe.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Moore said a dancer was suspended in midair and the audience floated in the water below. You could actually swim underwater during the performance and see, and you could also kind of explore the cave system around the central stage, he said. As well as going anywhere or doing anything, you can look however you want by creating an avatar. For Moore, that's a bulldog. So I look down and see these big meaty paws. Yeah, so I mean, parts of this,
it almost, I mean, I can't help but feel that this almost sounds so childlike in a bad way. Like this is like a child's fantasy, but like not a child who's actually doing something creatively constructive, right? It's just, I don't know, it's so dumb. It's really, do I just sound like a total old fogey by saying that? Maybe I do. But I mean, we're these incredibly intelligent beings, potentially, with so much capacity to create and innovate and change the world and change ourselves and better the human condition. And we're reduced to become, in sort of inhabiting these avatars like bulldogs with meaty paws. I mean, come on, like we can do much better than that, can't we?
Well, and I wonder too, I mean, I wonder what he gets out of that he wouldn't have from playing a much better made video game. You know what I mean? Like if the thing he's interested in is a virtual experience that's visually arresting and, music and audio visually arresting, I think he's going to get that better actually out of some of the games that, companies are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into producing. That are genuinely a lot of the time like very entertaining and like often like a really interesting medium for storytelling, right? It's the same thing as with 3D movies have been around since 2009 now in their current form, right? As like most big releases have like a 3D version. I don't know anyone who likes going to see movies in 3D. And I think that's because like if the movie is well made enough, you don't need it to be right. Like the
technology is not quite there yet. I mean, I know I haven't seen many 3D movies. I've really only seen a handful, but the one experience where I did watch it in 3D, where it was a genuine experience, was Avatar. That was unusually well made.
Which is the exception that proves the rule, right? Because that came out in what, 2009?
Yeah, literally came out in 2009.
Okay, so it's right at the dawn of that technology. and it's the
But
only
it's also
movie I
James
can.
Cameron, though. Cameron is a crazy perfectionist.
It's James
Yeah,
Cameron, and it's
yeah.
the only movie I can think of where it's a worthwhile experience to see it in 3D. You know what I mean? And there have been tons of movies that have come out in 3D in the aftermath of that that are not anywhere near as like I went to go see Dune in
Yeah.
IMAX, and
Oh, yeah. How was
that was
that?
an incredibly impressive experience, just
Mm.
seeing it on a huge screen
Yeah.
with its visuals, with
Uh-huh. Yeah,
the
yeah.
music and everything. I didn't need it to be in 3D. I probably
Yeah,
would have
yeah, yeah,
enjoyed it
yeah.
less had it been in
Well,
3D.
but and here's the counterpoint to all of this, right? I mean, in the form of a meme that I came across, I think last night or today. God develops ultra-realistic metaverse where people can talk and learn and work with other people, calling it universe, right?
Yes, yes. Is
So
that
I
an Onion
mean,
article?
it must be right. No, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
I don't know where it's sourced from, but uh, which is to say, right? You mentioned earlier on reference Plato's Allegory of the Cave, right? I mean, this is like even one or a few steps even further removed with the metaverse, right? I mean, it's like really getting into deep caverns of the cave,
Yeah.
right? Where we're,
And I think like look, I always want to think in terms of a spectrum, right? Like I want to acknowledge the potential of a thing before I'm just like, a stick in the mud about it. So like, is there some kind of potential in the use of this technology for artistic, for spiritual, for philosophical uses that could be positive? Absolutely, right? One of the most digestible forms of the philosophy of Alan Watts that I'm familiar with is the game Everything, right? Which actually like won a Hugo Award because it's such an artistic playthrough where you can be everything from like the conceptual geometry at the foundations of reality to like an entire universe, right? And you're just like transitioning back and forth between forms and kind of playing around. And in the background, Alan Watts is talking. And it's like, okay, that's a game that is genuinely, not dissimilar from what really important cinema can try to do, right? Or from what non-textual, non-physical text and art forms try to do. So like, is it possible? Yeah, absolutely. Will people misuse it? Will particularly like wealthy and powerful people who have a vested interest in like, a pacified populace that would rather, be invested in virtual reality than in like local community and solidarity and whatever? Absolutely, right? And so, there's always a question for me, at least, when it comes to technology like this around on the one hand, I want to acknowledge like why are people interested in this and try to be charitable and not assume that it's just because people are stupid and evil. Like no, that's
but
that's a
are also people are the very manipulable. They're also
people
very
are
yeah.
manipulable, people are gullible, people are people don't know what they don't know, and that's the fundamental actually like hallmark, right, of a critical education is the intellectual humility of admitting that look, I've got two master's degrees, right? I've got one in religious studies, I've got one in classics. I can read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and French. I can sort of read other Romance languages related to Latin. I can tell you a lot about the formation of like most world religions. I can tell you something about most of their texts. I can sort of comment in a very generalist sense on all kinds of things socially and philosophically and politically and whatever. Everything that I know is infinitesimally small compared to what I could know even just about the fields that I'm actually invested in, right? So like even if I went and got a bunch of PhDs or something, and I specialized intensely on like a certain number of topics, I wouldn't be able to know everything about those topics. I wouldn't be able to know everything about the topics those topics relate to. And I still wouldn't know most things. I don't even know most of what I don't like, most of the limits of my knowledge, right? Like I don't even know. Yes, Socrates is the guy for this, right? It's like I don't even know what there is to know, most of what there is to know. Like, consider how big just the observable universe as we know it is, right? Trillions of galaxies, trillions. That's not billions, which is already a lot. Trillions of galaxies, each boasting billions and billions of stars with their own worlds, right? And that's just what we can see. That's just what we can see. And you know, if you go up the Kardashev scale for alien civilizations, like what else could be in our observable universe? We go up the Tegmark scale for what different kinds of multiverse there could be, right? I mean, reality is quantitatively infinite, like our traditional philosophical systems tell us to believe, right? It's quantitatively infinite. There's no limit to the number of forms that the infinite God chooses to manifest in. And for that reason, most things are forever unknowable to us, even just as topics of conversation. What that should inspire is an intellectual humility that says, look, I know some things pretty well. I don't know most things. And that is the best defense against gullibility, right? Against being a useful idiot. For people who have a vested interest in you not being very smart and not being very powerful, right? The biggest intellectual power you can lay claim to is, yeah, I don't know, you know, I don't know. And what I do know is entirely mediated to me, right? Like, I don't have an immediate grasp of reality other than in particular moments of contemplation or mystical intuition, right? I only know in part, and I know as mediated to me by my senses and as mediated by my like abstract reasoning powers. And so when we come to the metaverse, what we're really doing is we are changing the sensory world where we get all of our, you know, data from, that we then are critically abstracting into like conclusions and concepts about reality. Right.
Well, so something that occurred to me as giving that brilliant description of just how much, just on a physical level, putting aside for, you know, for the time being, metaphysical stuff, right, spiritual dimensions, just on a physical level, there's so much out there. It's insane, right? And excuse me, we're going from that perspective, right, where we just don't know where any of the stuff begins or ends, right, to this, right, which is a little creepy for me, that we call it, you know, horizon workroom. Like, my room is my horizon. This is the extent of it, right? I'm extracting myself, or becoming extracted. I mean, however we want to language it, maybe it's a mixture of the two. Because if there are pressures from work to do this, then, you know, that's not always out of choice. But I'm extracting myself from the physical realms of being and limiting myself to this very limited realm, and saying that this is my horizon. And then this whole new universe, the metaverse, is being created around me, and it's an ongoing project, right? It's really at its early stages, right? Its earliest stages. But what does that say about where we're going? I mean, from an Islamic theological point of view, right? It's the Dajjal, which is translated in you know, sort of Christian language as the Antichrist. The Dajjal is literally someone who makes the false seem real, right, and makes the real seem false, right? So the real world, you know, that's not really where the stuff's at. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that the metaverse is the literal Antichrist, but I mean, we can't help, I mean, I at least can't, or one sometimes can't help but think through some of these things, right? That,
well, we should be conscious that magic can go in many different directions, right? So when you brought that up, the image that came to my mind is actually, you know, in South Asian religions, Maya, which comes from the same Indo-European root as magia, as magic in Greek. Maya is both the power of creation. It's Brahman's Lila, right? His play, God's play in manifesting and, you know, the quantitatively infinite finite forms that he can manifest in. But it's also illusion, right? Like what can happen to us, excuse me, is that we can be so enchanted by the multiplicity of the world that we end up mistaking it for a genuine multiplicity rather than a non-dual reality that's subsisting in God. And in that way, I would sort of apply that blanket metaphysical principle to, right, what's going on here, that you know, the power of creation can either be good, it can either be a manifestation of artistic creativity, right? Like people could theoretically use metaversal technologies for positive uses, right? Like, you know, you could have holograms, you could have like hologram calls, that could be cool, right? You can, you know, you can do cool stuff with it, but you could also you know, you can also end up using this as an illusion, very Matrix style, right? That keeps you from the real. And so this is one of many ways that I think, you know, both Dajjal, Maya, you could also invoke the figure of Mara from Buddhism, who's the master of illusion, right? Who wants to keep everybody, you know, entranced with the illusions that keep samsara going. I think that, you know, this is one of many ways in which religion provides intellectual resources for thinking about what's going on today and where these things could take us in the future, not in the form of like a direct one-to-one kind of prophetic, you know.
No, but helping us to make, I mean, these are, I think, tools that have been handed down to us, you know, myth, and this is the power of myth. Myth isn't something that's just, you know, make-believe. It's sort of a distillation of, speaking of the collective, you know, unconscious or consciousness, right? It's stuff that's been distilled over many, many centuries, right? Sometimes thousands of years. And the reason why this stuff still is around is because it's worked, right? It has worked, it works, and hopefully it will continue to work. But maybe to continue with the article a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and can we just plan to? Sorry, I'm conscious of time. Can we plan to wrap up in the next like 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, no, that I think that'll be a good point. Yeah, so we'll read to the end of the article, and then the article isn't that much longer. So okay, cool. It's from a bulldog bathing in a bejeweled cave to poke in the stratosphere. There is no end to the possibilities, right? This sort of limitlessness that's being presented to us, and Zuckerberg sees big things ahead for both the metaverse and his company. Who should own the metaverse? There are many questions about what role Zuckerberg's company should play in building the metaverse. Meta's vice president of Metaverse, Vishal Shah, is adamant that the company doesn't want to dictate what's created within. We're explicitly not trying to build this alone. It's kind of like saying, what company owns the internet? It doesn't really make sense if you frame it that way, Shah said. Instead, the vision is that Meta provides the backbone for the metaverse in which everyone is invited to come, play, build, and experiment. And we've said pretty clearly that we want these experiences that get built to be as interoperable as possible, because that creates the most value for creators, for consumers, for the economy. We want to build the underlying infrastructure. This concerns more. I think it should be for everyone, and it should not be controlled by any one company. Certainly, it should not be controlled by a company that's demonstrated that they really put profits over people at every step of the juncture, he said. The company has recently been pummeled by revelations in a cache of leaked documents that show how it has failed to control misinformation and extremism, and detail a host of other problems. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, Shah said the company had learned from its struggle and would build safety and privacy into the metaverse. I think we're in a better position because we've dealt with those things to ask the right questions up front to ensure that we are thinking about them in a way that can be future compatible, he said. Then there is the question of whether people really want the future to be the metaverse. Meta is betting that they do and plans to spend at least $10 billion just this year on its metaverse division and hire 10,000 people to work on it during the next 5 years. The company worries that Facebook is losing relevance as its users age, according to the leaked documents, so staying on top of the next big technology trend like the metaverse to attract younger people may be key to Meta's existence. Tech analyst Benedict Evans isn't so sure it will play out that way. He believes that every 15 years or so, there's a great generational reset in tech and that we're at the start of one now. In his recent essay, Metabrand, he offers a warning. Tech history is full of companies that dominated one generation trying to seize the next. They tend not to make it. The incumbents very rarely create the future, and the future very rarely comes from a centralized $10 billion project. So a theme that I'm seeing at kind of every layer of this discussion is discomfort with transience, right? Discomfort with transience on the part of people who are afraid of technology, just intrinsically because it's technology. Discomfort with transience on the part of tech companies that want to stay relevant, right? So that idea that, you know, Facebook users are aging, so it's becoming less relevant. I mean, I'm not going anywhere from Facebook because I've been on it for so long, and I find it useful for various things, not least sharing of scholarship that I don't have access to otherwise. But also, you know, to my mind, it's not a problem if I eventually get to an age where Facebook is just dead because it's, you know, it's no longer the people, you know, don't no longer exist to kind of keep it running or to keep it relevant. That's also because, right, like I don't have billions of dollars at stake in Facebook's success or decline. But I think that shows, right, like they, you know, Facebook wants a kind of permanency and relevance, right? Like they want a kind of permanence and changelessness to their you know, place on the landscape. And so do all these, I mean, like this desire for the immortalization of the concept of the self that's in transhumanism, that's in these tech companies trying to reshape society with the metaverse. It's the cause of all this dukkha, right? It's the cause of all this suffering, or these false concepts of the self. And there's something to be said for learning to be comfortable with our own moment in history, both with its possibilities and with its perils, and to be comfortable with the fact that like a lot of what we build and do will waste away, right? There was a scientific study that was published, I think earlier this year, maybe in previous years, I can't remember, but it was called the Silurian Hypothesis. Silurians are a class of creature in Doctor Who are basically Earth-based reptilian humanoids that preceded the human race. And the Silurian hypothesis goes like this: if there was a sapient and industrial society prior to the evolution of humans on the face of the planet, how would we know? And the findings of the paper were basically we wouldn't be able to, because in the span of time that elapsed between the evolution of humans and, you know, the last great extinction event before them, basically all remnants of such a civilization would have disappeared, right? They would have been lost, kind of no matter how impressive or technologically advanced their culture had been. Time would have eaten them away. And it is, you know, like as the Wikipedia article just said, it's a thought experiment, right? Like we're not saying there were lizard people. It would be cool if there were lizard people, but, you know, we're not saying there were. The idea is rather just how imperious is time over our existence? And the answer is absolutely, right? This is samsara. This is the sublunary realm. This is whatever you want to call it, right? This is an existence where space is a function of distance and separation, where time is what theologian Paul Griffiths calls the metronome, right? Where matter is subject to decay. Is this how God intends for the universe to be? Most of our religious traditions say no, right? Like this is sort of like the pit of existence. And in its ideal form, all of space, time, and matter are redeemed and glorified, and they're very different from the way we experience them now. And part of the goal of spiritual transcendence in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism is to escape the cyclical trap, right, of samsara, and to achieve a more stable existence. But it's interesting that at least in Christianity's vision, a la St. Gregory of Nyssa, the vision is for epektasis, right? It's for a constant, infinite quest, ever deeper, ever further up and further into God, because the self, the finite self, is fundamentally mutable, right? It's fundamentally changeable. There is no unchanging self for ancient Christians. the positive aspect of that is that it means that there's a never-ending possibility of ever further divinization of the self, right? And
It's
so,
very similar in the Sufic, Islamic context, that it is, right, rather than seeking our sort of immortalization on this kind of horizontal realm, our ideal, the goal that we should be striving for is this constant sort of rending of the veils, our relationship to the divine, seeing with ever greater clarity, right, the uncreated light. I mean, in to the best of our ability. So,
and these are the only worthy goals, because it's not going to take, like, we're not talking in terms of thousands, millions, billions of years before the movement, the ripples that we make in our lives kind of peter out, right? Like, talking 100 years max before most people who are connected to me in some way have forgotten that I existed, right? It's and learning to get comfortable with that, and learning to get comfortable that even in a situation of spiritual transcendence, what's good in me is not lost, but a lot of what I understand myself to be gets lost. That's already happening in this life, right? It's already the case that I've been tons of different people, right? And the person I am now is conventionally related to, like, the infant that I was, right, and the teenager and the young college student, conventionally and related in terms of succession, and, like, memories of being those people stay with me and they continue to shape me. But my being is much more like a river than like a statue, right? Much more like a river than a mountain, you could say. And in that sense, the worthy spiritual goal is to try and cultivate that, like, that changing of the mutability into ascent into God rather than descent into nothingness, right? And it's because our, like, Western culture in general has lost that sense that what immortality means, what resurrection is for, what what that permanence is not taking me as I am right now, freezing it and making sure it lives forever, because that would actually be hell, right? That would actually be profoundly awful. It is first to learn to sail the river, right? Learn to sail the river of time, learn to be where you are in history, and progress, right? Progress towards that telos of all things in God as best you can from within history. But it's also learning to be comfortable with the fact that, as to wrap it back around to my favorite Christmas movies, my favorite Christmas movie is A Muppet Christmas Carol, right? And as Kermit the Frog, as Bob Cratchit puts it, life is made up of meetings and partings. That is the way of it, right? This life, that is absolutely true. Do I, as a Christian, believe firmly that there is a transcendent end where it is all meeting and no more parting? Yeah, that's the goal, that's the hope. But in history, you're never going to find that. You're never going to succeed in immortalizing us in some particular frame of what we are now, or even what will be in the near future. The transhumanist dream doesn't work. I mean, for goodness sake, like, let's just deal with the fact for a second that every year the planet strays about 3 feet further outside of the habitable zone of our star. Like, let's deal with the fact that every dream of these people for expansion of human civilization into the stars faces innumerable obstacles that, like, in sci-fi and fantasy, we can just sort of ignore, right? Like, we can, the thing about Star Wars that actually the comics are, like, kind of starting to deal with, but that the movies don't touch on at all, is that it actually takes thousands of years to build a civilization where hyperspace automatically connects an entire galaxy, and, like, there's like a common culture, right, that everybody participates in sort of across these different worlds. I mean, you know, the dreams that people have about this stuff, none of us are going to live to see it. You know, our grandchildren won't live to see it. And so does that mean that we don't do any of it? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we learn to get comfortable with the way that dying is the path to life, right? We learn to get comfortable with the way that learning to let go of the things that we are so desperately attached to, that is actually the way to receive everything, right? That, I mean, that's the heart, at least in my religion, right? Of this is the heart meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. Yes, it promises us that we will be raised in glorified bodies at the eschaton. I believe that. But as a mystical practice, what it means is that the path to life is to cultivate an inner awareness of this sense that it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? It's no longer the I, the ego, that is my fundamental self. My fundamental self is Christ, and the ego acts as a tool of Christ, right? For filtering Christ's life in and through the particular finite being that I am. Yeah. And you know, the real resistance to the matrix, the real resistance to abuses of the metaverse is the cultivation of this spiritual attention, right? It's the formation of communities where this is front and center, where the use of a metaversal technology would always be tempered by a spiritual attitude, right? And that's never something that we're going to be able to legislate into law. It's never something that we're going to be able to guarantee in terms of the people who control these technologies. It's only something that we can do our best with ourselves. So sorry, that was a lot of talking.
That's amazing. No, I love that. That's awesome. Really cool. I have nothing to add to that. That's brilliant. I mean, that's a powerful way to powerful note to end on. Thanks so much, David. Really appreciate your time.
God bless you.
God bless you too, always, brother. More conversations to follow. Thank you all for joining us. Please like and subscribe and share with loved ones. And yeah.
And once you've done that, go visit A Perennial Digression.
Absolutely. That's David's own channel, and David and I and others are going to be doing more of these things, God willing. God bless.
Yes. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, David. Talk soon.